Hello, everyone. I'm Virginia Brackett, and I want to welcome you all here this afternoon and thank you for joining us for what I know will be a wonderful conversation among three very distinctive writers about how they have learned from landscape and allowed it to influence their writing. You've already met two of the presenters in our very stimulating earlier sessions, Mark Turcotte and Paul Darling, and we're going to add to our group H.C. Palmer, a member of the Kansas City Veterans Writing Team, and a poet I'm very fortunate to call my friend. I'm not going to repeat everyone's bio info here because you can find them in your workshop information. But some essential information about HC is that he is an MD, a retired internist, and was co founder of the Kansas City Veterans Writers Team now in its 10th year. Also, a veteran of the Vietnam War. So, welcome, HC. And the way we're going to organize this, I'm going to ask each of you to read your piece, just one right in a row, and then we'll come back and discuss those a bit. So let's start off with Mark. If you'll please read your poem,
Sure.
Go.
Okay. Go. Back when I used to be Indian, I'm gripping the wheel with both fists, plunging headlights northward out of a long and syrupy night. Texas behind me. The Anadarko Basin, Will Rogers Turnpike behind me. Tulsa and the Jesus radio. Praise be, I leave 1,000 ghosts howling in the rearview mirror. The dank honky-tonks behind me. Easy heated flesh, flickering tongues forked with poison, empty hands, boot-scootin' rodeo queens stagger in red taillight glow. I stop to fill her up, drowse over one last plate of biscuits with sausage gravy, bottomless cup of coffee, and gone again. Just west of St. Louis, a nodding hitchhiker catches me with his sign, Mother, Funeral, Detroit. As he climbs in, I say, man, you can sleep all the way to Chicago. Ahead, the pavement shimmers, ancient Mississippi flows. I cross over. Silent sun and morning dew make grassy stars. The hum of rubber on the road, telephone poles. Lines lead to lines to the edge of the city where we both wake up. Praise be, I swear I hear poets singing on the radio.
Thanks, Mark. And Paul, could you read your excerpt from your book, please?
Okay, so awkward point is I didn't save it, so I'm gonna have to bring up the email real quick. So how about you skip me, and then I'll
Sure.
bring that up. I felt like I'd be able to see it on here, and I'm not really good at this.
Okay, no problem. So HC, would you please read 5 Notes from War, number 5?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? I don't have a
Yes.
mic or anything.
Yes.
5 Notes from War. The handsome medic from Southern California was straddling our trench latrine and singing a Beach Boys song when shot by a Viet Cong sniper. A high-velocity bullet behind his right ear. Cranium and contents, facial bones vaporized. Half a scalp of blonde hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, nose, and lips intact. Ask yourself, what could a battlefield surgeon do? I was thinking funeral, how to reconstruct his face, one last look at sunshine beauty. I was thinking Michelangelo as I worked inside the cavity to replicate nasal bones, cheekbones, forehead, a smile, until suddenly ashamed, and with the nation's shit on my hands, I heard myself singing, wouldn't it be nice if we were older?
Thanks, HC. Paul, did you find it?
I think I got it.
Great.
As we walk down the, I'm sorry. As we walk down the road, there's a cascading stream that flows to the tarmac after being siphoned off for watering the orchards. The children play along it. The flowing water can even be heard over the creaking of the Humvee suspension, and the still darkening sky gives the scene a very peaceful feeling. Right now, while awake, I feel serene. I like to go up and play catch with the kids, share some food with them, and rest my back among the trees. Freed of my body armor, going to sleep would be instantaneous, much nicer than the fob. While the sun still hits the higher portion of the hill to my right, we are walking in the shadows. This is pleasant, I think to myself. Only 500 more meters to the Tarnac and another 1,500 meters to Highway 1. The whole way, minus crossing the river itself, is perfect IED terrain. There's only one way up and down on the far side of the river. IEDs are most often on the highway in these choke points right next to it. Kanata's predecessor was killed, along with 3 other soldiers, on just such a trail. We simply can't avoid them, and the Taliban know it. Yet at this time, that risk is far from my mind. I'm committed, and the decision to take that route is already made. Inshallah. Right now, in the cool of the shadows in the late afternoon, the sound of laughing children and splashing water, it wouldn't be a bad day to die. There are worse ways to go.
Thank you. So, for our brief discussion this afternoon, I'd like for us to focus on the way time and timing function as elements of landscape for each of you in your work. So, for instance, Paul, your excerpt and your work as a whole very much live in the moment, with your entire book encompassing a single day's activities, whereas Mark, your speaker, begins calling our attention to the past with your very first statement, back when. Then we're with the speaker in the present, and we're literally watching things move into the past in the rearview mirror, so to speak, and then looking forward to the future with that word ahead. And in H.C.'s poem, time seems literally to stop, as of course it does for the medic at that very moment in time, and then the speaker's considering how to move forward. So all that being said, could you each comment on the importance, perhaps, of establishing a sense of time for your readers to your work, or maybe even to yourself? And Mark, let's just start off with you, if you've had a moment to think about that.
Sure. First of all, what an amazing observation by our facilitator. I'm just shaking my head going, wow, you're right. Exactly. All of that is happening. And I guess for me, first of all, I need to say this out loud. It's my Ojibwe duty to say how mesmerized I was just by these 2 samples of writing by Paul and HC. I mean, what they're writing about makes me feel like I should be, on another panel somewhere, I'll tell you. But anyway, it's just really moving. I mean, the last line, oh my God, you guys, both of your last lines are stunning. Anyway, for me, it's less about, I got, because I spent a little bit of time in the performance poetry scene, like the slam scene and stuff like that, you can get into a bad habit of spending too much time thinking about your audience, and your reader, and all of a sudden what happens on a page is kind of meaningless. And so I've had to I got sucked up into that a little bit, but I had to remind myself that my real goal wasn't to acquaint my audience so much, but to set myself into my work, So the first thing that needed to be in the landscape of my poem is me and my memory, and everything that I write begins with some sort of memory, whether it's a memory from 50 years ago or 50 minutes ago. So I always do that, and I stay very much within myself. I never write poetry where the I is anybody but me, and I never, inflate, the experience, at least that I'm aware of. Who knows? But so for me, I often start in a sense of present tense, just to see where it goes. And if it doesn't work, then I'll try past tense. And if it doesn't work, I'll try second person kind of future tense or something. But the present tense is my go-to. And then, of course, when you're in the present tense, you're very welcome to drift into the past and the future, So it seems kind of simple, but I won't take credit for giving it any more thought than that. That's the place that's easy for me to begin, in the present tense. And then people will say, yeah, but that's your present tense 30 years ago when you were leaving Texas. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it's very easy for me to put myself into that present tense and not have to think of it as the past. Okay. How's that?
Sure. Yeah, that's good. Sure. And that whole idea of perspective that we bring to our writing is also all tied up in this. And I'm sure we've all experienced this with reading. You can read something when you're 20 and go back when you're 30. It's a different reading. And when you're 40, because our landscape does change and all of our experiences as well. So makes perfect sense to me.
Thanks.
Paul, what about your thoughts on time?
So in my book, if you remember, the absolute first thing that I write is the time, to try to ground the reader in understanding the pace of that single day. And every chapter starting off opens up with what time is it when we're doing this. So, I'll say it takes 10 minutes, but chapter 1, it starts at 3:45 in the morning. And then, when we roll out, it's like 05 something in the morning. And so time is critical because it's one day. And I want people to understand that I write, maybe in a chapter 7 to 10,000 words, but I may only be describing 10 minutes, or I may be describing 4 hours. Because what happens when you're driving in the middle of the desert is really slow and boring, and I can't write too much about that. But what happens in close combat? You listen to H.C.'s story. How long was that guy straddling a slit trench and he got shot? Moments, seconds, but you could stretch that period out for several pages if you so choose, because there's just a lot happening. So for me, it was critical that one day be grounded in an idea of how long each section was taking. And Mark brought up a really good point, is a lot of times we write without thinking about what we're doing or what the tense is or anything deliberate. And I think the most important advice to be a good writer is to be a voracious reader and to hear the styles and to see things. And if I hadn't read Ivan Denisovich, I wouldn't have wrote the book that I did. And so the more you read, the more you're exposed to different literary devices and different tenses and techniques, the better writer you're going to be. So anyways, I think hopefully that captures your question. I got to say, HC, I was a recipient of emergency facial reconstruction surgery. And I was ugly before, so it wasn't that the surgeons were bad. They actually tragically reconstructed my face pretty accurately. So thank you for doing that. And I've been on the other side of trying to help someone, so it's tough.
So, HC, over to you, sir.
Well, I'll just talk about this poem. I wrote this poem 45 years after the incident, and as a matter of fact, all of the poems I've written are that far. I'll just explain this poem a bit. We were looking at body bags after a firefight was over, and this guy, medic, says, "Doc, you got to see my friend from California, the surfboarder, the beach boy. You got to see him. You won't believe it." And he unzips the bag, and I look in there, and he was a beautiful guy. I say that truthfully. And it was, my description is accurate of what I saw. Now, I came from a background that when I was a senior in med school in my first year of residency, I made money doing autopsies at night in the morgue at the university hospital. So it wasn't the first time I had my hands in somebody's cranium, So that part wasn't hard, but I think the part of it was when I got down to what could a battlefield surgeon do, I was starting to feel it. It became more than just an examination and looking. And then the real tough part of it was he'd fallen in a latrine, and obviously he had contents of the latrine all over his head and shoulders, and what I saw. And I thought then, what I believe more now, I had a nation's shit on my hands, And so this poem morphed over quite a long time, but it's one of my anti-war poems. I don't know how much more anti-war you can get. And as far as time, you know, it was all in the moment until I looked on my hands and I saw, besides blood, I had his shit, or a bunch of guys' shit on it, the whole nation's shit. That's the statement I wanted to make when I wrote the poem. Or as Mark calls it, poems, P-O-M-E-S. That's what
Poems.
they are. They're poems with hair. Yeah, sure.
Absolutely. Well, and you've each mentioned time in a personal way, that for none of you went home and wrote this immediately after any portion of this had happened to you. It took some time. And so we go back to this idea of perspective, I think. And just wondering if you would advise people to just wait before they write an experience, or is there value in going ahead and writing down what you believe you saw and
I'm on
knew
a
at
conference
the time,
call.
and then coming back later to take a look at that after you've had some more perspective or maybe considered it in context? So, anyone?
Well, I spoke when I wrote my book, how I deliberately wrote it within a year of the events and finished writing it a year to the day after it was done, because I wanted it to be accurate and honest. And it would be a different book if I wrote it now. One, my memory wouldn't be there. And writing it in the context of a failed war, when I wrote it, we hadn't lost yet. We weren't winning it, but we hadn't lost it yet. So I would certainly, it would be a different book if I waited. It might be a better book. I don't know, but it would be different. So I think, who's the audience and what are you trying to tell? And do you need to write it? I needed to write that. I needed to write that book. I knew I needed to write it right away. Not everyone has the urgency of the moment to write. And it's no sense trying to force something if you don't feel you have to get that story out. So I'd say write it as soon as you feel you need to write it. That's the next week or the next decade or 50 years after the fact.
Well, I'm of the school that, to tell a true, Tim O'Brien, to tell a true war story, it takes a long, long time and a lot of perspective. And your story, Paul, was much different, and yours was a day in your life, and you had to get it. You had all the details, but this one, I couldn't have written, and almost every poem I've written, except for the last one I wrote, it's written in the context of the Vietnam War, because it's in my mind everywhere. Even the prairie poems I write in my book are about, everything I write's about the Vietnam War. Or the American War in Vietnam. I'm sorry, named it wrong. But I can't do it with, obviously, if I'm writing about something that happened 50 years ago and I'm still doing it, it takes me time to do it. I don't find myself very successful writing a poem, except maybe I hope the last one I wrote in a short time from the time it happened.
Well, I'm fascinated to hear your two versions of this process, because it's so personal. I mean, my answer to this thing is that it's got to be personal. My own personal way of doing this is based on my own abilities and my own experience, which is some of the worst poems I've ever written have been fairly immediate responses to my experience. And I always regret it. I always regret writing about things too soon, but that's just me personally, you know. And then I guess listening to the both of you talk, I'm aware that it kind of depends on what someone's purpose is. I don't want to use the word agenda for either of you. I would never use that, apply that to you folks, but we often talk about this as, what is your agenda? What are you trying to accomplish? In both of your cases, it sounds like the way you approached it was the correct way, you know, for what you were trying to accomplish, right? And I would never tell either of you not to write about your experience in war, that you should wait and think about it first. You should just do it the way you need to do it, right? But like, for example, if you recall, 9/11, some of the worst poems I ever read in my life were those collections that people did, commemorating 9/11, and then it was all like they were just coming out within 6 months of the event, and I was personally offended. I had friends, I knew people that didn't get through 9/11, and I was kind of just offended for them at the way it got treated by a lot of either really bad writers or just people who hadn't had enough time to think about it. So my general advice to my students is I tend to say, give yourself a little bit of time. Give yourself some time, and before you write something that just later you think is so foolish, but for skilled writers, I think they just need to do it when they do it. They know, and their bodies know when. I think.
Mark, I'm reminded of a quote that I had to remind myself of when I was writing. It is, no written work is ever finished. It's only abandoned. You can polish and try to find the perfect word, but eventually you just look upon it and you're like, I can't do it anymore. And that could be a week, that could be an hour, that could be 30 years of looking at the same written piece. But eventually you just abandon it to the audience and hope for the best.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Well, I keep mentioning in my other sessions that I have this Ojibwe sensibility, and part of my Ojibwe sensibility is that no story ever ends as well. That there's always a next day. You might run into the last page of the story that you're reading, but it doesn't mean the story ever ended. So I hope I have a concept of, the ongoing nature of this stuff. But your process, just listening to you say, Paul, why you decided to write it when you did, just makes me respect it all the more, and for both of you,
Well, we don't have very much time. This is a pretty short session, although very rewarding. But Paul has talked a lot during this workshop about making the protagonists of the story relatable. Readers need to be able to relate in some way. And as far as poetry goes, I would imagine perhaps that would apply to the speaker of the poem or the topic. But I wondered then if y'all want to comment in closing on whether you even think about how people will relate to your speaker or your topic or your person. And if you do, how do you approach that when you begin? Or perhaps it's something that you don't think about until you come back for revision.
HC has to go first this time.
I only think about what I think about because it's my poem. And, some of the things, like I said, I'm so anti-war. I don't care whether the people that don't like them, that's fine with me. But I don't write for what other people think about, except for maybe some editors that I respect, and I don't want too many red marks on my poem when I send it to them to look at before I send it out. People I respect, 2 or 3 people I respect, and one of them is running our panel right now. So, but no.
Okay, so you don't give any thought to that, and yet I will throw out there, you do make it relatable simply with the Beach Boys and with the song. That doesn't mean that people will relate to your purpose, but they can at least bring, they can share in some way, I think, with what's happening, and it may help them better understand your point by the end as well. But Mark, what about you?
I think I've commented before so far about, the struggle that I've had with being, one of the weird things that happens to your work is that once people start writing or publishing it, people start writing it, and then they start having opinions about it, and then you start having audiences. It kind of changes the nature of the process. It becomes like this job a little bit, like work. And then you realize that if you're lucky, people have expectations of your work, that you then have to make a decision about how much you're going to worry about those expectations. And I just think of if I think of myself as the author of my work, I'm not sure if it's easy, if I can ever make anybody feel relatable to me and my perspective of the world, you know? So I guess I just hope that our common humanity, you know, and that's a good example actually with the Beach Boys thing is, I didn't even realize it until you just couched it that way, Virginia, but I myself kind of later went, wow, when was the last time I heard that song and what was I doing? You know, I wasn't doing what the guy in the poem was doing. That's for damn sure, you know, and so that's the way, I don't know if it's about being relatable or about just saying, oh, I live in the same universe as this speaker, you know, of HC's poem. I live in the same universe as these people, but it looks completely unlike, you know, anything around me. I mean, that's one way that I'm able to relate to both of these writers, because obviously I've been fortunate enough never to have been placed in that situation. And it devastates me. Their telling of their experience I find really devastating and important, and you know.
Well, and again, Paul,
Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. No. And again, Paul, you've talked about this somewhat. And when I asked a similar question, it might have been last night, you mentioned the use of children throughout your book. You hoped would draw people into it. I also found you're using Star Wars to help people understand the desert landscape, and even some of your characters was wonderful. Gosh, I think Lady Gaga even came up on one occasion. So using those references seemed to help too. But maybe you can kind of have the last word here and talk a little bit more about your use of the children throughout.
Well, like I said, children are universal, and they don't have the experience or scope. Okay, my dog wants to say hi. Okay, my apologies. Dogs are also, I bring up dogs because there's a lot of dogs in Afghanistan. I want to make sure we protect dogs. I like dogs. Sometimes I like dogs better than people. Anyways, with children is they're bright-eyed and they're happy, and you give them something small and they love you for it. And you know, everyone can envision what a 4-year-old looks like, regardless of what country they're in, and whether they're Afghan or Afghan, or I say Africa like it's a country, but you know what I mean. And so I miss my kids. When I deployed, my youngest was 1 and my oldest was 10. And I had 2 in between. And so seeing the kids reminded me of the responsibility I had to them as a father. And I was comforting to see kids because it kind of gave me a sense of purpose of why I was here, what I was attempting to do. Because I know the kind of future they had under the Taliban, and I know the kind of future they're having now, and it's not good. I don't support that strict Sharia way of life. Obviously, I don't live there. If I did, I'd live in a Sharia country, but I don't. And so the children, one was something that's universal, and everyone can envision children who are happy and bright-eyed, and you can feel for children who are hungry and scared. And for me, it was children was a shared sense of humanity that even in war, I think everyone could appreciate it and draw a reader in and have a sense of relating to a protagonist simply because they like children. I guess W.C. Fields wouldn't have appreciated it, but most readers do.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all who attended our discussion. I wish we had a little more time, but we're going to break away to give people a few minutes to get prepared to come back in for the open mic reading. And we hope to see several people there who would like to share their work with others. So again, thank you to everyone, and we will see you all at 3:00 at the shared reading.